Jesus died in the late afternoon, just hours before the Jewish Passover meal was to begin in the evening. Mark says it was, quote, the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, unquote. That's Mark 15:42. The rush was to remove the bodies of Jesus and the two others crucified that day from their crosses before sundown. Once these holy days would begin, Jewish law and custom forbade the corpses of executed criminals to be left hanging past sunset, much less through a holiday like Passover. There's a text in the Torah, Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23, that made that part of Jewish law and custom. Josephus, the contemporary Jewish historian, explicitly mentions this practice, asserting that the Jews took down those who were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. And that's a quote. This rush to bury provides us with our first insight into why Jesus' tomb was found empty Sunday morning. Mark tells us that Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the Sanhedrin, the governing council of the Jews, obtained permission directly from the Roman governor Pontius Pilate to remove Jesus' body from the cross and take charge of his burial. Again, I'm going by Mark, our earliest account. That's Mark 15:42 through 46. Apparently, Joseph had sympathies toward Jesus and his followers, since he shows up suddenly in Mark's story and voluntarily exercises his influence to facilitate Jesus' burial. Given the impending festival that began at sunset, there was no time for full and proper Jewish rites of burial. That would involve washing the body, anointing it with oil and spices, and otherwise preparing it. The women of Jesus' family who'd followed him from Galilee had plans to carry out these duties, but had to defer them until after Passover and the Sabbath. So the crucifixion is on a Thursday that week. Passover is Friday the next day, a holiday. And then the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, follows. If you look at Mark 16:1. As far as these women go, there's no indication that they were in communication with Joseph of Arimathea at the time he took Jesus' body or through the Passover. The followers of Jesus had mostly fled in fear and were hiding. We're told that the women watched from a distance, surely a bit frightened themselves, but wanting to know where the body was taken. Again, I'm following Mark here. The burial was in the hands of Joseph, but they hoped he would allow them, as Jewish custom prescribed, to carry out the traditional rites of burial and mourning for the family. Mark says that Joseph of Arimathea wrapped Jesus in a linen shroud and laid him in a rock-hewn tomb, blocking the entrance with a stone. There are hundreds of these hewn-out cave tombs of this type in the Jerusalem area, some of which have been excavated. I think over 1,000, according to the last count that I got. So what Mark describes is very familiar to us. They typically have small squared entrances that can be blocked up with a stone that's cut to fit. They are of various sizes, but are intended for family burials. Mark says nothing about where this tomb was or how or why it was chosen. But the Gospel of John provides a key missing detail. John is often very good at these kinds of geographical, chronological, and even archaeological details in his last chapters, particularly. I'm not talking about the theology of John, but the core story, what's usually called the Passion narrative. That is, Jesus' last days in Jerusalem, his arrest, his betrayal, his crucifixion, his burial, and so forth. So here's the quote from John 19:41 through 42. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a new tomb where no one had ever been laid. So, because of the Jewish day of preparation, that's for the Sabbath and Passover, as the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. So John has the chronology, I think, pretty straight. He says, for example, at the trial before Pontius Pilate, that Jesus' enemies, the Jewish priests and authorities, I call them the Jewish mafia of the time, who wanted Jesus crucified, they wouldn't enter the Roman area of the Praetorium in meeting with Pilate because they had to eat the Passover that night. So the Passover officially on the Jewish calendar is Thursday night at sunset, and Jesus is dead, we think, by about 3 p.m. People assumed that the tomb into which Joseph of Arimathea placed the body of Jesus belonged to him, but here we see that such was not the case. That's John 19:41 and 42. It was a newly hewn tomb with no one buried inside that just happened to be close by. Jesus' body was laid inside, but only temporarily. He was not really buried there, since full and formal burial involved the preparation rites and mourning rituals carried out by the family over a 7-day period. That's why the women show up early Sunday morning at the tomb, expecting to initiate the burial process with Joseph's cooperation. This is after the Passover feast on the 15th of Nisan, that would be Friday, and Saturday, which is a weekly Sabbath. Jesus' corpse would have been badly mutilated with bruises, wounds, and dried blood. Preparing it for proper burial would require quite a bit of time and effort. The body could not be left exposed over the holidays, and the empty, unused tomb with its blocking stone would provide protection from predators. Joseph's actions were practical, temporary emergency measures. You won't find this pointed out in an Easter service coming up this year. We have to assume, since Joseph had taken responsibility for Jesus' proper burial, that his intention was to fulfill this obligation as soon as possible after the Passover. When the Sabbath was over, that's the weekly Sabbath, on Saturday night, he would have had his first opportunity to properly bury the body and presumably return to the temporary unused tomb to remove Jesus's body for permanent burial, hence the empty tomb. So it's not a matter of the body being stolen or the disciples trying to start a rumor that he's raised from the dead. These are much later accounts that Matthew mentions in terms of rumors about Jesus' resurrection. This is a very practical and obvious thing that would have happened given these circumstances. Now back to Joseph. As a man of means and a member of the highest judicial body of the Jewish Sanhedrin, it makes perfect sense. Based on Jewish law, he would not have placed Jesus in his own family tomb, but would have provided a separate tomb for Jesus. What Mark knows is that very early Sunday morning, just as the sun was rising, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Salome, most likely Jesus' sister, came to the tomb with the intent of washing the body and anointing it with oil and spices. When they arrived, the large blocking stone had already been removed from the tomb, and the tomb was empty. The body was gone. This was precisely what one might expect given the circumstances of Joseph's intentions and activities, but it was a total surprise to the women. They arrived fully expecting to be involved in the rites of a proper and final burying. That is why they arrived so early, so as not to miss Joseph, who they expected would return at first light Sunday morning. But they arrived 12 hours too late. What they did not consider is that Joseph had returned to the tomb the instant the Passover Sabbath day was over at sundown. Mark says that when the women looked inside the empty tomb, they saw a young man sitting inside who told them, "Do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has risen." Literally, he's been taken up. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him as he told you. So that's Mark 16, 6 through 11. Here, the line between history and theology is clearly drawn. That the tomb was empty fits what we know of the circumstances of Jesus' temporary burial by Joseph of Arimathea. But that the women were told that Jesus would meet his disciples in Galilee is clearly a theological embellishment. It is Mark's attempt to connect the empty tomb with subsequent appearances of Jesus. The link is very weak, since Mark knows of no specifics of any appearances of the risen Jesus to the disciples in Galilee. Otherwise, he surely would have related them to round out the ending of his gospel. I think we have to assume that Mark tells us all he knows, but what Mark knows he gets from Paul. Mark is following Paul here, since it is Paul who reports that Jesus first appears to Peter and the disciples, and in Mark's account, the young man sitting in the tomb specifies Peter by name. Look at 1 Corinthians 15:5 also. In other words, the young man says, go tell the disciples and Peter. Mark relates next that the women fled the tomb in fear and amazement, and that they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's Mark 16, verse 8. The oldest, most authentic copies of Mark end abruptly here at verse 8. The additions found in most Bible translations, where Jesus appears to various people mentioned in Matthew, Luke, and John, were later interpolations by scribes added to Mark's gospel by editors who could not imagine a gospel ending without appearances of Jesus, which actually makes this ending all the more compelling to historians. Mark also knows an old tradition, not mentioned specifically by Paul, that the first time Peter and the disciples saw Jesus was in the Galilee in the north, not in Jerusalem the week of Passover. So think about that. He doesn't mention any appearances in Jerusalem. The young man in the tomb says, he'll see you in the Galilee as he told you. This is not a minor difference from Luke and John, as we will see. It is a blatant counter story. You got to choose which is which. And I would go with Mark and Paul. If we put Mark and Paul together, we get the earliest and most reliable tradition. Faith in Jesus' resurrection began in Galilee with Peter and the apostles as the first to claim they had seen him. Sightings of Jesus, as Paul calls them. Matthew and Luke, using Mark as their source, follow closely his account of the women finding Jesus' tomb empty, though Matthew adds all sorts of supernatural elements. So an angel comes from heaven, flashing and looking like lightning, and Roman soldiers guarding the tomb fall over like dead men, and there's an earthquake and so forth. Both flatly contradict, that is Matthew and Luke, they both flatly contradict Mark's statement that the women said nothing to anyone. And in Matthew and Luke, they run to tell the disciples. All four of our accounts seem to agree, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that the discovery of the empty tomb by the women that Sunday morning did not inspire anyone to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. The assumption of everyone was that someone had removed the body. The Gospel of John offers an alternative empty tomb story that is not based on Mark. And although John is our latest gospel, this particular story seems to offer us a less theological account of what happened. That has led me and other historians to conclude that John's account might represent a much earlier independent tradition. Now, this would only be the first 10 verses of John 20. If you read those first 10 verses as they are as a separate piece, you're probably getting the closest we can get to what happened Easter morning. I'm going to read those 10 verses very carefully. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, quote, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid him," unquote. So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. And both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen clothes lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen clothes lying there, and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who'd reached the tomb first also went in and saw and believed, for as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. Interesting, because their homes are in Galilee. If you think of this circulating independently as the earliest account, it would even predate Mark in terms of what it says. And this is exactly what you would expect. They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, they meaning the burial party, Joseph of Arimathea and those who helped him, and they fold up the clothes and leave them there. They're bloody and they're soiled, and they just leave them in the tomb, and there they are. This is not a resurrection. This is removing a body from a temporary safe spot that would keep it from predators over the holidays. It has nothing to do with Joseph of Arimathea's family tomb or his estate, and it certainly wasn't a permanent burial. I call it a burial of emergency or a burial of convenience, because John says it just so happened that near the place where he was crucified was a garden, and in the garden was a tomb. I personally think it's the Mount of Olives, and I think the disciples are staying at Bethany on the back side of the Mount of Olives on the east side, and they run to the tomb, and they know where it is, having heard from the women. John, of course, gives other stories following his account, these first 10 verses. He has Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene, the disciples as a group, later including Thomas, the famous doubter. But if you just take the first 10 verses as an early account that's been embedded in John, it just reads exactly like you would expect. There's no young man or angelic interpreter in the tomb in those first 10 verses to proclaim the resurrection. Instead, Mary's quite sure the body's been taken away for burial. They've taken the Lord out of the tomb. We do not know where they've laid him. One has to ask, who's the they? And obviously, Mary Magdalene has in mind Joseph and his assistants. After all, just a few verses earlier, John tells you that the tomb was a temporary one. So I think I've made that point. I've argued a version of this reburial scenario in a previous book called The Jesus Dynasty, and one response in particular from a dear friend and esteemed colleague who's now passed away summed up some possible objections to my thesis quite well. So I'm going to read you from an email that he wrote me. James, you say that the body of Jesus was removed from its temporary resting place to a permanent tomb. This is not at all impossible. Extreme improbability sets in only when you invite us to assume that this group, who knew perfectly well what had actually happened to the body of Jesus, permitted their co-religionists to proclaim not that he was still alive, immortality of the soul and so forth, but that he was risen from the dead. This, of course, is against the background of what resurrection meant for first century Jews. So this friend of mine is arguing that it's resuscitation of a corpse, and I disagree with that. I'll keep reading. In order for me to take your evidence seriously, you would have to explain why the family and or the disciples based their future lives on what they knew to be a falsehood, namely that the body had been raised and finally to justify how the secret was preserved in one of the gabbiest societies in ancient history. And I've heard from others over the years that make this same kind of objection and sometimes expand it. Like if they knew the tomb was somewhere in Jerusalem and everybody knew the body was in it, then how could they possibly believe in resurrection? Well, I think that's a misunderstanding of resurrection. And it's not because the early followers of Jesus believed in his immortal soul surviving. They believed, according to Paul, that he was raised bodily, but in a new spiritual body, and that the old body was left behind. In my judgment, there's several incorrect assumptions embedded in this objection of my friend. According to Paul, the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection more generally of those who follow him, that's going to come at the parousia, was understood as the re-embodiment of one who died, not the resuscitation of a corpse. You know, for a corpse to just come out of the tomb is not really resurrection of the dead, the way Jesus and his early followers believed it. Paul, particularly our earliest witness, makes that clear. And Jesus, when he's asked about resurrection of the dead in the Gospels, and particularly in Mark, our earliest account, says, well, you err if you think it's just some sort of a resuscitation of a corpse, and then people resume their normal earthly physical lives, that in the resurrection, people are transformed. There's no marriage, there's no male and female, there's a transformed existence. So obviously, for Jesus and for Paul, the idea of resurrection of the dead is not pulling a dead corpse out of a body and having it somehow walk around and say, I'm alive. That would not actually even be that impressive. So here's what I think happened. The Gospels, written decades after Jesus' death, began to connect the empty tomb and the disappearance of Jesus' body to subsequent and immediate appearances of Jesus to his followers, even the same day in Jerusalem, to prove he'd been raised from the dead. But we will see these are late explanations of an earlier tradition. What Mark only implies, quote, you'll see him in Galilee, is lavishly embellished by Luke and John, but it's now set in Jerusalem. On the Sunday after the crucifixion, Jesus walks around, wounds and all, eating meals, claiming he's still flesh and bones, directly contradicting Paul's emphatic assertion that Jesus has become a life-giving spirit by the resurrection. He's embodied, yes, but not a corruptible physical or material body. It's a mistake to allow these later texts to frame our objections and take priority over earlier materials. So if you take Mark with no appearances, you take John, the first 10 verses of chapter 20, you begin to get a picture of most likely what happened historically. Whether the family and followers of Jesus knew immediately where Jesus had been reburied or learned of the location later, they were not running around Jerusalem in that first week following Jesus' death, proclaiming he'd been raised. In fact, a critical reading of our sources will show that there were no sightings of Jesus in Jerusalem at all, but only in the Galilee, other than perhaps some single experience of Mary Magdalene. And I'm not even sure of that because that's already on the road to glorifying Jesus as a resuscitated corpse, a flesh and bones, a flesh and blood person. John does mention that appearance to Mary Magdalene, and so does Matthew. The matter of a first appearance to Mary Magdalene is always possible, but she's not included in the first witnesses that Paul relates, perhaps since appealing to the testimony of a woman was considered less than convincing. So if we want to sort this out, sometimes clues show up from the most unexpected quarters. In 1886, a fragmentary 8th century AD copy of the Lost Gospel of Peter was found buried in a grave of a monk in Egypt. Eusebius a 4th century Jewish historian, had mentioned the existence of this Gospel of Peter, and he regarded it with disfavor, for good reason, as you're going to see. It's written in the first person, claiming to be by Peter, but scholars generally place it in the late 2nd century. Some put it earlier, though. I would tend to put it earlier, at least in its substance. It narrates Jesus' death and resurrection, and scholars have debated without resolution whether it is dependent on our New Testament Gospels or represents an independent tradition. It has a highly legendary flavor to it and quite a few fantastic embellishments. However, at the end of the text, the author seems to retell his empty tomb story in a much more straightforward way for a second time in the text. The second account of the empty tomb starts reading like you might expect. It's almost identical to Mark. It is as if he's passing along two versions. One is highly fantastic and legendary, and the other is more sober and realistic. In the second version, Mary Magdalene and the other women arrive at Jesus' tomb, finding it empty. And as in Mark, they encounter a young man, not an angel, no earthquakes, nothing like that. And the young man tells them Jesus has been lifted up or he's risen. And they flee the tomb frightened. And then you have this critical, tantalizing ending of the Gospel of Peter in our version because the text breaks off. Let me read you the last few lines. So this is after the tomb is discovered empty. Now it was the last day of unleavened bread. Listen to that. Last day of unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is 7 days. So this is a week after Easter, the Sunday morning discovery of the empty tomb. This is a week later. And many went to their homes because the feast was at an end. So this fits perfectly with Jewish law and tradition. After Passover, you wait a week, you celebrate till the last day, which is also a holy day, the 21st of Nisan. But we, this is Peter in the first person, but we, the 12 disciples of the Lord, wept and mourned, and each one grieving for what had happened, returned to his own home. But we, the 12 disciples of the Lord, wept and mourned, and each one grieving for what had happened, returned to his own home. Now remember, that's also what we had before in John, that they returned to their home. But I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew took our nets and went to the sea. So they're up at the Sea of Galilee. And there was with us Levi, the son of Alphaeus, whom the Lord, and then it breaks off. This is astounding. Think about it. In other words, we have a Gospel of Peter that breaks off at this point, but it tells you that during the week following Easter, they wept and mourned, each one grieving for what had happened. They haven't had any visions of Jesus all week, and then they head back to the Galilee. And that, I think, fits with Mark. He'll see you in the Galilee. And presumably the text went on to tell you about some of those appearances. And we have an account of that Galilee appearance in Matthew 28 and John 21, which is a kind of appendix to John. This text, the Gospel of Peter, this ending of the Gospel of Peter, is a bombshell in its implications. The Passover festival lasts for 8 days, and according to this text, rather than running around Jerusalem celebrating various appearances of Jesus, Peter and the rest of the disciples spent that week in Jerusalem weeping and mourning. And at the end of the 8-day feast, they returned home to Galilee, still grieving for what had happened. Each one went to his home, and Peter, with his brother Andrew, returned to the fishing business. So they're back at Capernaum, Capharnaum, on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. This evidence, namely, that the followers of Jesus returned home to Galilee in despair and mourning, and even went back to their businesses, and only sometime later in Galilee began to have faith that Jesus had been raised from the dead, It rings true with all the rest of our evidence when put in proper chronological order. The body of Jesus resting in a tomb in Jerusalem was no threat to their faith that Jesus, though dead, had been vindicated by God and was indeed the Messiah they hoped for. That we even have such a text running so counter to the reports of appearances of Jesus in Jerusalem the week following his death, and given the subsequent embellishments of the Gospels with multiple appearances of Jesus, is quite remarkable. The text also fits in with Mark, who mentions no appearances of Jesus, but also relates the tradition that the disciples returned to Galilee. It is more than likely that the Gospel of Peter, after this abrupt break, went on to narrate sightings of Jesus by Peter, Andrew, and the others. So strangely, you go to John chapter 21, it's like an appendix after chapter 20, and you get these various appearances in Galilee when they're back fishing again. So I think, we have a skeleton of historical information here that we can put together. Matthew follows Mark with his emphasis on Galilee, and what he relates is quite telling. Notice the language carefully. Now, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Presumably, Matthew's associating a specific mountain as a place of visionary experience, much like his account in chapter 17, where Jesus appears to be transfigured, a shining being with Moses and Elijah, raised from the dead. So, what do they look like? They're in these glorious new bodies. These are not resuscitated corpses of Moses or Elijah. Many scholars have suggested that the account of the transfiguration that's related first in Mark 9 is a misplaced resurrection story. Whether that's the case or not, what we learn here is that Matthew only knows a single story of Jesus appearing to his disciples. But look, it takes place in Galilee, a misty mountain visionary experience, and some doubted. If we put all our sighting evidence together in chronological order from all our sources, including the evidence from Paul, we get a really interesting breakdown, and one can clearly see how the stories expand and develop. Here's a basic summary that I think can stand up historically. Paul had his revelation of Christ approximately 7 years after Jesus' crucifixion. He claimed that he saw Jesus in a glorious heavenly body. Twice in his letter that we know as 1 Corinthians, he equates his own experience of sighting Jesus with those who'd seen Jesus earlier, based on traditions he'd received, mainly Peter, the 12, group of 500, James, and the rest of the apostles. Then he says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he was seen by me. He does not say when or where these earlier sightings by the others took place, but since he mentions the 12, he might be referring to a time when Judas Iscariot, who was dead, had been replaced, which would mean several weeks had passed since the crucifixion. Mark has no account of anybody seeing Jesus, but the young man who meets the women at the tomb tells us explicitly, go tell the disciples they'll see Jesus in Galilee. Matthew relates that the women who went first to the tomb are told by an angel to go tell the disciples they'll see Jesus in Galilee, and they run to convey this message. Literally, tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. Matthew closes his gospel with the scene on the mountain in Galilee. Then we come to Luke. Luke writes that later on that first Sunday, two men were walking on the road to Emmaus. Subsequently, says Peter saw Jesus, no details. That evening, Jesus appears in a room with the 11 disciples gathered. He eats with them. He shows them his physical body. He says, I'm not a ghost, not a spirit. I'm flesh and bones. John says he appears to Mary Magdalene outside the tomb. Later that evening, the rest of the disciples, and then Thomas comes 8 days later. He appears again. They're still in Jerusalem, and they're touching and seeing his wounds, and the whole point is he's not a ghost. The appendix to John gives a separate story. They're up in the Galilee, they return to their fishing, and they see Jesus on the shore from a distance. And the Gospel of Peter ends with them leaving Jerusalem a week after the crucifixion, mourning and sorrowful, no hope in the resurrection, and returning to the Galilee. So even though Mary Magdalene and the women have found the tomb empty, the disciples have no faith that Jesus is alive. They're in despair. Two important observations emerge from this breakdown of sources. Number one, the earlier texts, Mark and Matthew, agree that the disciples encountered Jesus only in the Galilee sometime after the empty tomb was discovered. They're actually told to go to the Galilee. Presumably, they wouldn't have left until after the 8-day Passover, because that's just part of the observance in Jerusalem. And their experience would have been several weeks after Jesus' death. Matthew's account indicates that whatever encounter they had, it was more visionary and subject to doubt. As a kind of addendum to the Galilee tradition, even though they come later chronologically, the Gospel of Peter and the appendix to John, that's John 21, indicate that Peter and the others returned to their homes in Galilee, and Peter and his brother Andrew resumed their fishing. So that's the earlier text. Then the later text, look at the contrast. In the later accounts, that's Luke and John, Jesus's appearances in Jerusalem are immediate on the same day the tomb is discovered. And according to Luke, for 40 days after, they don't leave Jerusalem. And yet in the early text, they're told to leave Jerusalem so that they can finally see him. These dichotomies are quite striking. Let's list them. Where? Where did it happen? Galilee or Jerusalem? When? Immediately on the day the tomb was discovered or weeks after? What? A visionary-like experience or the resuscitation of a physical corpse? Look at the differences. When you go with where, when, and what, and they're all opposite, there's no point in trying to harmonize, and all you got to do is just combine them and say everything happened. But that's not carefully reading sources, which I think we should be doing. The internal evidence is decidedly in favor of the Mark Matthew earlier tradition. To even imagine that these kinds of stories that Luke and John relate, set in Jerusalem, were circulating when Mark wrote his gospel is highly improbable. That Mark could publish the first gospel in Christian history and include no appearances of Jesus with the focus on Galilee, not Jerusalem, pushes our evidence decidedly in favor of the Galilee option. It is also hard to imagine a text like the ending of the Gospel of Peter even existing unless it were related to a strong tradition of remembering the sorrow and despair of the disciples following Jesus' death as they returned to their vocations in Galilee, giving up hope. It is not an edifying story, but a realistic one, and it fits our earlier evidence. Growing up, I would always hear this analogy of an automobile accident. You ask all the witnesses, and they all say different things. But if you put them all together, they don't exactly harmonize, but you get the truth. Well, when you start looking at this material the way I've gone over it, it's pretty clear to what we should give priority. And Paul then is a decisive witness. He does claim to have seen something firsthand. He's the only first person witness that we have, where he's writing with I, first person, saying, "This is what I experienced." And he equates his sighting of Jesus with Peter, James, and the rest of the apostles based on his personal acquaintance with them. Given his view of resurrection of the dead as being reclothed in a glorious heavenly body, he would have found the emphasis on flesh and bones meaningless. When Paul says Jesus was buried, he's indicating that he knows the tradition of Jesus' body being put in a tomb. His point is to emphasize that Jesus truly was dead and buried. What then was raised on the third day? not the perishable mortal body, but a new spiritual body, no longer flesh and blood. The old body having been shed like discarded clothing. And that's exactly the image that he gives in 2 Corinthians 5. You put off the old clothing. It's like a tent compared to a permanent building. Jesus' own teaching about resurrection, which I mentioned earlier, emphasizes an angelic like transformation in which even the sexual distinctions of male and female and marriage and so forth are dissolved. So, why does this shift from Galilee to Jerusalem come about in Luke and John? And why their insistence on connecting the empty tomb with the literal appearances of Jesus? I think we can assume the reasons were largely apologetic. These texts come late in the first century. Some maybe put them in the second century. We have sophisticated Greek critics of Christianity like Lucian, Trypho, and Celsus. They're right on the horizon. Their common charge was that Christianity thrived among ignorant, simple minded, gullible classes of society who were led away by foolish tales of deluded women and hallucinations passed off as visions. There were also similar rival tales of other divine men circulating. Apollonius of Tyana, a Pythagorean wonder worker, born about the same time as Jesus in Asia Minor. According to his followers, Zeus fathered Apollonius, so he, like Jesus, was the Son of God. He healed the sick, raised the dead, and ascended bodily to heaven. Various versions of his death were passed along, including one where he was arrested by persecutors, set himself free, and was taken up from earth into heaven. And according to another story, he appeared mysteriously to a doubtful follower after his death and convinced him of the doctrine of immortality. There's a fascinating stone inscription containing an epigram that turned up in Asia Minor, not far from Tarsus, where Paul grew up. Here's the quote: "This man, named after Apollo, in shining forth Tyana, extinguish the fault of men." In other words, he's a doctor of the soul. "The tomb in Tyana received his body, but in truth, heaven received him, so he might drive out the pains of men." So he's like a spiritual healer. As with Jesus, there were debates among Apollonius's devotees. Did his body remain in the tomb, or did he go bodily to heaven? We get all kinds of traditions about Orpheus and Abraham and Christ and Apollonius. If Jesus' followers came to believe in his resurrection only after a period of despair and in Galilee, far removed from the empty tomb in Jerusalem based on visionary experiences, they were surely open to the charge that the entire phenomena was mass hallucination. And that's why we began to get this emphasis: I'm not a ghost, I'm not a spirit, I'm flesh and blood, I'm flesh and bones, I eat, touch me, see my wounds. These New Testament Gospels and the book of Acts take us decades beyond Paul into a time and place that he never lived to see. It is deeply ironic that Paul is in some ways the shadow behind all four of our Gospels. Yet to understand Paul, we need to put the Gospels aside, which means, at least in terms of sources, to learn to read the New Testament backward. If we can resist making assumptions and pick up Paul's letters with fresh eyes, we'll capture an amazing moment in time for which he is our only firsthand source. Just a decade or so after Jesus' death,